Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. A very, very warm welcome to those of you who are here with us in person tonight, and also those of you joining us online. I'm delighted that tonight's PPE Centenary Lecture will be given by Professor Mathias Thoenig, our Centenary Visiting Professor in PPE. And before I formally introduce Mathias, I would really like to say a few words about the Centenary Visiting Professorship in PPE. It's a partnership between UNIV and Queen's, and its purpose is to bring the work and ideas of academics from outside Oxford to Oxford to engage with our community here, our students, as well as our staff. The visiting professorship rotates between disciplines and colleges, and I'm delighted that Mathias is the first of what we hope will continue to be a long and distinguished list of visiting professors. Mathias, if I may quote your words about this visiting professorship, and you look slightly surprised, so you might forget that you said that, but I'll tell you what you said. You said, after 100 years of excellence, rigor, and breadth, PPE is more than ever a landmark educational program and a vibrant source of inspiration. Its distinctive interdisciplinary flavor makes PPE uniquely suited to understanding the complex society challenges of our time. As an economist and teacher, I'm honored and delighted to be engaged in this intellectual journey. So if I may, a little bit about you. Mathias Thoenig is a professor of economics at the School of Business and Economics at the University of Lausanne. Mathias received his PhD from the Sorbonne and his BA in engineering from École Polytechnique. He has held visiting and statutory appointments at the International Monetary Fund, MIT, Queen Mary, University of London, Sciences Po in Paris, the University of British Columbia, and the University Pompeu Fabra, which I found out is in Barcelona. He also served as on the editorial boards of the Journal of the European Economic Association and International Economics. His research, and this is absolutely fascinating, lies at the intersection of international economics and political economy of development. In a series of influential papers, he studied the relationship between international trade and armed conflicts, and how the global architecture of trade agreements is shaped by conflict risk. He has also analyzed the conditions under which trade can build trust or alternatively foster conflict. His current research agenda focuses on democratization, violence-induced migration, and post-conflict reconciliation. He uses cutting-edge quantitative analysis to form policy-relevant predictions for conflict containment. And many questions addressed in his papers are particularly high on the policy agendas of international agencies and NGOs that pursue the joint objectives of peace and development, something that is particularly close to my heart. So, Mathias, over to you. Tonight, you're going to talk about narratives, nation building, and conflicts, a perspective from economics. And we're all really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. No pressure.
Thanks a lot, Valerie, for this great introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's a great honor for me to give this centenary lecture. And I'm really looking forward to your feedback and questions. So the overall topic of the lecture is about narratives and nation building. But given how wide is this topic, I decided to take a specific angle, which is the angle of conflicts. Okay, conflicts are major elements of nation building. And so what I would like to look at in this lecture is how narratives about wars impacts perpetuation of violence or can participate to reconciliation. So I will be, next slide, I will give you some examples of what I mean with war narratives. But to make it simple, let's say that this is a selective recollection of facts about past conflicts, and it's a selective framing of war memories about the causes of past conflicts, about the deployment of violence, and about reconciliation. To a large extent, those war narratives are based on two elements. But given how they are selected, many of those narratives at the end turn to be forged. Okay? And there is a famous statement by Napoleon Bonaparte who said once that history is a set of lies we all agreed upon. And to some extent, those war narratives make justice to this statement. We know from historians that narratives, serve a political agenda. They can serve a political agenda for setting the path to future conflicts and, perpetuate violence. They can set the path for reconciliation and uniting the country again. And so the question I would like to tackle with you tonight is whether those narratives are performative, in the sense that do they really change behaviors? Can they really trigger actions, political actions? Or, by contrast, do they react? Are they ex post rationalization of political actions? Window dressing justifications of political actions. Okay, so the causality could go both ways. And so what I want to show you tonight is how we can use causal analysis based on large data set to address those questions. And with this respect, I will use the toolkit of applied economics, which is a field that came in the past 20, 25 years with a very large set of tools to conduct causal analysis on large data sets. Okay. So let me give you some examples of war narratives. So many of them relate to founding myths, those myths that are used in the cultural process of building nation. And those founding myths are often mobilized by politicians to justify wars. In the context of the current conflict in Ukraine, Putin was, several times using the fact that Kiev and the Kievan Rus was the cradle of modern Russia. And so, with this respect, had to be defended. Another very common war narrative relates to threat narratives, that are narratives that relate to the fact that there could be an internal and an external threat, an external internal common enemy, such as the population should unite and fight against these common enemies. So this type of narrative has been recently used in Myanmar against the Muslim Rohingya. And then you have simpler narratives, just hater narratives, such as narratives against the Tutsi before the genocide in the early 1990s. And you have denial narratives, narratives that just deny what happened. If you look at Turkish textbooks today, there is, of course, no mention of the Armenian genocide. Okay. And so if you want to be even more precise, you can look at what are the narratives used by Putin to justify the Ukrainian conflict. What he says is that Russia is actually protecting Ukrainian people against Nazis who took power after the 2014 coup d'etat. He mentioned the fact that the West and the potential adherence of Ukraine to NATO is an existential threat to all regions. Okay, so this is a common enemy, the West and NATO. And he refers to the great patriotic war that was fought during World War II by the Soviet Union against the Nazi Germany. And so, to a large extent, this new war against Nazi echoes this patriotic great war. Okay. So those are examples of war narratives that are used in the recent years. But you could, I'm sure, we all know many of those narratives that was used in the past by politicians to justify wars. Okay, and so indeed, the role of those narratives is to solve collective action problems and to justify policies, okay, such as justifying mobilization, justifying genocide, and also justifying action that contribute to build nation and institutions. And those narratives potentially act on beliefs of people, on their mental representations. They act on reactivating wounds of past wars in order to set, the stage for a divided and polarized country. But they can also act on sharing memories to reconcile. Okay. So I will first make a brief introduction to a set of facts that I would like you to keep in mind, and facts related to conflicts. And then we will speak more about war narratives. Okay, but let me just remind you some well-known facts about conflicts. The first fact is the fact that civil conflicts and wars represent the most prevalent form of political violence in the world. Here you have a time series evolution of the number of conflicts per year since World War II until 2014, and with a breakdown by type of conflict. Okay, so the red conflicts are, if I'm not mistaken, interstate conflicts, and the rest are, so the blue conflicts are colonial conflicts, and the rest relate to civil conflicts. And you see that the vast majority, if not all of them, conflicts relate to civil conflicts. Okay. And in the past recent years, there has been a surge in the number of civil conflicts. For example, in 2019, 54 different distinct conflicts have taken place, which is the highest number since World War II. Okay, so political violence, with no surprise, we all know it, is coming back. Here it's a map. Those are two maps that are here to give you a sense of the tremendous data sets that scholars can use in the field of economics of conflicts and political economy of conflicts. Those data sets have been built by research institutes, and they report at a very fine-grained level geo-referenced violent events. Here it's for the food world. Here I just plotted for Africa, because Africa is by far the most violent continent in the world, followed by Asia and Middle East. And so here it's those are all battle-related events. So each dot here is an event that is a battle that has been observed over the 1997-2022 period. And that represents more than 281,000 violent events over the period. Okay. And scholars make use of those spatial data to conduct their analysis. And thanks to the fine-grained resolution, people already can tackle causality link in the data. So the right panel represents conflict. When you aggregate all those violent events at the level of an ethnic group, then you get this map. And so that tells you that 458 ethnic groups actually are victimized in Africa over the period, meaning that they experience a violent event on their ethnic homeland over the period. So, of course, the human cost of those conflicts is huge. Here you have a time series evolution of the number of fatalities related to conflicts, directly related to conflicts. And again, you see that in the last decade, there has been a big spike in the number of fatalities going up to more than 100,000 per year. Okay, so those data do not report the genocide, the fatalities of the Rwandan genocide of Tutsi. But what you have to keep in mind is that for each person killed, directly killed on the battlefield, there is statistical studies show that there is an average one additional fatality, indirect fatality, that is due to disease, disruption of health services, contamination of water, etc., etc. And on top of those fatalities, forced displacements are massive and are also rising tremendously in the past decade. In 2021 alone, 9 million of persons were forcibly displaced because of political violence. Okay. So the human cost is huge. And now if you take a global picture, roughly what you have to keep in mind is that roughly 1/3 of the world population is exposed directly or indirectly to civil wars, and that civil wars and conflicts represent a huge impediment to economic development. Out of the 34 poorest countries in the world, 20 actually are ridden by conflicts. Okay. And a distinguished scholar from Oxford, Paul Collier, came with a number that on average, a civil conflict reduces GDP by 15%. This number, it's a quite old number, but it has been recently confirmed by another study. So it's in the ballpark of 15 to 18 percentage point reduction of GDP. Okay. And so beyond those costs, of course, you have additional costs that are less tangible, that relates to depletion of social capital, depletion of education, etc., etc. Okay. So the question now is, given that those conflicts exert a so huge cost, in terms of human lives and in terms of economic cost, why is it that we observe wars? We know from econometric evidence that actually in a conflict, all parties that are involved lose something. They lose. Okay. And so in the jargon of economics, it means that war is Pareto dominated by peace. And so you would expect that actually to observe no war at equilibrium. You should expect that when there is a dispute between groups, between potential belligerents, and there are many reasons for those disputes, the potential belligerents find a way to de-escalate the conflict, the crisis, okay? But it does not happen every time, and sometimes there is a bargaining failure, okay? And so that's a puzzle for the literature, and many studies have tried to study why, conceptually, but also in the data, why bargaining and negotiation fail. So that's one aspect of the thing. The other aspect is, why is it that disputes at the first place take place between groups. Here, there are many reasons why groups, ethnic groups, countries may disagree. Okay, but and so I don't have time to list all of them. If you are interested, there is a recent survey by Esteban and Ray listing and looking at those determinants of disputes. But broadly, you can categorize those disputes in two big sets. The first set of causes relates to socio-economic structure, things that are slowly moving, and that relates to the presence of natural resource, to political institutions such as autocratic power that tend to be more violent than democratic power, demographic structure, the presence of young men potentially is a factor of disputes, etc., etc. Okay. The other category relates to beliefs and representations. The fact that there are grievances between ethnic groups. There is religious intolerance. There is nationalism. Okay. And potentially those, the second category of reasons for disputes is more malleable and can be influenced by narratives. I will come back to that in a few slides. Just you to know that the dominant view in the academic literature is actually that the main explanatory, the variables that have the largest explanatory power in the data relate to the first category, the socio-economic structure. The second category that is called sometimes, okay, because those first elements, really shape economic incentives. And with no surprise, economists believe that those elements are more salient than the second elements that relates to what is called grievances in the literature. Okay, good. So now let's talk about narratives. And how narratives relate to what is the interplay between the perpetuation of violence and war narratives. So wars are persistent and recurrent. Okay, so the average duration of civil war is around 8 years, but many wars last more than 12 years. In the last decade, 90% of the countries that experience a civil war actually experience a past war in the last 30 years. Okay. And statistically, the best statistical predictor of future wars are past wars. Okay. So why is it that there is such a perpetuation of political violence? Well, first, very naturally, it's because those socio-economic structures that are the reasons for the disputes have a high inertia. They are slow moving. Okay. At the point where scholars in the field came up with the notion of conflict trap, the fact that there are many positive feedback loops that tend to reinforce civil conflicts. Just to give you a sense of one, poverty tends to increase the likelihood of conflict, and conflicts in turn, because of the economic damages, tend to increase poverty. And so you have this self-perpetuation and this positive feedback loop between poverty and conflicts. When it turns out to the second category, belief systems and representation, well, potentially those elements have less inertia in the data. And so there is room for narrative, for the worse or the better, to influence those systems of representations and beliefs. And so potentially to exit the poverty trap. So let me now give you, that's the rest of the lecture, to give you some examples based on papers, research papers, where we can study the role of narratives in perpetuating or curbing violence. So the first example is based on a beautiful paper by Voigtlander and Vogt that was published in 2012 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, where they document the medieval origins of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. And so the starting point is the 14th century. And the fact that after, when the plague arrived in Western Europe, many minorities were blamed for the plague. And in particular, Catalan people in Spain and Jews in what is now Switzerland, Germany, and the Low Countries. And it all started in September 1348 in Château de Chillon, close to Lausanne, on the what is called sometimes the Lake of Geneva, but which should be called the Lake Léman, by the way. And and in Château de Chillon, a Jew named Agilent was tortured and forced to confess that Jews were poisoning wells. And the church came with a conclusion from those confessions that there was a big conspiracy against the Catholic Church. So given that we are in Oxford and that you are all fluent in Latin, let me read the statement of the church at that time in Latin. So forget my accent, but there is no well-established accent in Latin. So ad interficiendam et destruendam totam legem Christianam. Okay, that was a conspiracy. And based on that, a wave of often centralized and coordinated actions took place to kill systematically the Jews in municipalities, mostly in what is now Switzerland, Germany, and the Low Countries. Just to give you an example on how horrible it was, in Basel, a wooden structure was built where 500 people were locked in, and the fire was put to it. It was systematic. And so what Environmental do is that they have first done a fantastic collection of data. They have been to the archives of the churches, local archives, at the municipality level. And they collected information on the extent of the pogroms in the 14th century and the extent of pogroms and repression against and persecution of Jews under Nazi Germany. Okay, and they combined those data sets. And so they ended up with a sample of almost 400 municipalities. And within this sample, they found that those municipalities and cities that tended to experience more pogroms 600 years ago, at the time of the Black Plague, actually, under Nazi Germany, tend to have higher pogroms in the even before the Nazis took power. Actually, even in the 1920s, in the Weimar Republic, there was already a surge of anti-Semitism in Germany. So those cities that experienced more pogroms at the time of the Black Plague tended to have 6 times more pogroms in the 1920s and 30s, to experience a 50% increase in the share of votes for the Nazi party, to experience more denunciation of Jews, more deportation at the local level of German Jews, and to experience more attacks against synagogues during the Kristallnacht pogroms of November 38. So how do Vogt and Weinlander make sense of this, to some extent, terrible but fascinating persistence of hatred over a time frame of 600 years? Even in municipalities where actually the Jewish community was destroyed after the Black Plague, the plague pogroms, actually even in the absence of hate, in the absence of Jews at the local level, they document the perpetuation of violence over those 6 centuries. So they rule out different stories in their paper. It's really a beautiful paper. I encourage you to read it. And they come up by, if you want, exhaustion of explanations. They come up with the main candidate, the main hypothesis for explaining persistence, which relates to the intergenerational transmission of a narrative that is specific to the Catholic Church, and that is, or the Christian Church at least, that is called the Passion of Christ. Okay, so they provide no direct evidence, and that's their interpretation. I insist on that. There is no direct evidence on this, but that's the main likely candidate. So the Passion of Christ is a play that is Easter play that is made of gospel sung, and that is often a performance that in the past lasts for between 2 to 7 days, where a big share of the village, was participating to the performance. It was in Latin first, and then became vernacular language in the later on. So yeah, in the 14th century, and it's hugely anti-Semitic. Okay. This Passion of Christ was still played in Spain in the 20th century, and so we have good documents on this Passion of Christ. And for example, in Spain, there was a game played by children before Easter that was called the Killing Jews game, and it was perceived as widely innocuous. So effigies of Jews were beaten, burned, and symbolically murdered. So this Aether narrative persisted for centuries, and according to Vogt and Weilander, this is the main media through which persistence took place in Germany, and explain why you can correlate in a quite causal way persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany and pogroms in the medieval ages. Now, 2 years after the publication of this landmark paper by Vogt and Weilander, David Yanagisawa-Drott came with a paper that established a more direct providing more direct evidence that actually narratives can kill. And he showed that in the context of the genocide of Tutsi in Rwanda. So what he looks at is what has been the quantitative impact of the intensity of the genocide, of the exposure of Hutu to the radio broadcast of Radio des Mille Collines. So Radio des Mille Collines was a radio which I think on a daily basis before the genocide and during the genocide called for the murders of Tutsi. And so the main challenge for Yanagisawa-Drott in this study was first to collect data on the intensity of the genocide and on the exposure to the radio broadcast of Radio des Mille Collines. And the second challenge is more methodological. I think you have to consider the fact that the correlation could be in both ways. It could be that the exposure to the Radio des Mille Collines hater messages trigger violence and genocide against the Tutsi, but it could be also that the Hutu villages that were more anti-Tutsi at first place were the ones who were the most demanding of the radio broadcast. Okay, so that's a demand side effect, if you want, demand for media. And so the way to filter out this reverse causation channel, the way used by Yanagisawa-Drott was to make use of the topography of Rwanda, that is a country that is super hilly. And so you have only two antennas. At that time, there were only two antennas that were, diffusing the radio broadcast. And so for exogenous reasons, you had some villages that were in the electromagnetic shade and were not able to be exposed and to get a radio signal. Okay, and so for those exogenous reasons, on the right panel here, you have some villages in blue that were heavily, intensively exposed to the radio broadcast. You know, those are the two antennas in the location. And in green, lighter green, those villages that were not exposed to the radio broadcast simply because they were on the bad side, if you want, of the hill. And what it does then is to correlate, then he collected information on the intensity of the genocide and then correlate spatially the two. And what he found is that the very fact of being exposed for exogenous reason to this ether narrative broadcasted by the radio d'Emile Colline increased the intensity and the number of fatalities during the genocide by 10 percentage point. Okay. So this program plays a role of coordinating the actions of people against the Tutsi at the local level. Okay, now on a lighter and more positive note, let me now give you some evidence on narratives that instead of killing are narratives that can heal. So this is based on a paper by Cillier, Dubé, and Siddiqui published in Science in 2016, and where they look at the reconciliation process in Sierra Leone. So so they conduct a randomized control trial, RCT. So RCTs are, if you want, the frontier methodology for conducting causal analysis. And it's based really on what you observe in public health analysis. Here in this context, there was a set of 200 villages that were randomly selected and that were exposed to the treatment. Treatment being the organization of a local forum where people from the villages gathered and started to discuss about violence and the war that took place in Sierra Leone, and where actually victims and perpetrators met under the umbrella of the NGO that was organizing this forum. Okay, 200 villages were randomly selected, and 200 other villages were randomly selected to be the control group. Okay, and then you can compare what you observe is a treatment group with respect to what you observe in the control group. And what they found is that forum participation increased social capital in terms of self-declared trust and forgiveness with respect to the former perpetrators. Increased contribution to public goods. You observe that in those villages where those forums took place, people tend to participate more to the community projects, to clean the roads, and et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, they found that participation to the forum deteriorated psychological well-being. They observed an increase in self-declared anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic disorder. Okay, and so the conclusion is that so we don't know the content of those narratives that people started to discuss, and with no surprise for social psychologists and therapists, I would say, but as a surprise for economists, the very fact of talking about those events had a real impact on people. Okay, but RCTs like that one comes with a limit. They are internally very consistent. You know, you are sure that what you observe in your data sets, you're pretty sure that it really captures a causal link. But like all RCTs, you are unsure about the external validity of your results. You know, it's based on a small scale. Yeah, you're right. Analysis. Okay, so I have to rush. I'm very slow actually. Anyway, so now what I want to show you in the last part of the presentation is, if you want, an attempt to scale up the Cillier, Dubé, and Siddiqui paper, and to look at how narratives at the level of a full country, can participate to reconciliation. And so It's a paper with Elena Esposito and Tiziano Rotesi and Alessandro Saia, the paper forthcoming in the American Economic Review, where we look at how the spread of the lost cause narrative is reunification after the American Civil War. Okay, so as you know, the American Civil War was by far the most destructive war in terms of fatalities in the American history. More than 2% of the population died in the line of duty. And so, the American society after the war was very, very fragmented. There was a period, an era of reconstruction, but and so during the era of reconstruction, the lost cause narrative was forged by Southern elites. And this narrative is, to a large extent, a revisionist story of the reasons, the causes, and the consequences of the US Civil War in an attempt to justify the defeat of the South, in the words of David Blight, who is a splendid scholar, historian working on the US Civil War. And it turns out that the lost cause narrative was popularized by the 1915 movie Birth of a Nation. Okay, and the plot of the Birth of a Nation movie follows a common enemy logic. That's the idea that it's really a racist call for Unionist and Confederate states to unite and restore white supremacy in order to face a new rising threat, which consists in the enfranchisement of the African American. So in this paper, we test the hypothesis that the societal cost of reunification between whites from the South and the North was the perpetuation of discrimination against African Americans. Okay, so just to go fast, the movie, it's a landmark movie in the history of cinema. It pioneered many new techniques. The filmmaker is David Griffiths, and this is one of the most, in PPE adjusted term, you know, it's one of the most profitable movie ever in the Hollywood industry. And it was considered the most influential film in the history of cinema by Ty Burr. And President Woodrow Wilson was president at the time of the release of the movie in February 1915, said there was a private screening of the movie at the White House. After the screening, he said, Birth of a Nation is like writing history with lightning. And my only regret is that it is all so terribly true. So what is true? This is, a 3-hour, the plot of a 3-hour movie in 3 slides. Okay, so that's 1 slide per hour. So the first part of the movie is about the Civil War that depicts the South, you know, the myth of the Old South. And it explains that the war was not caused by slavery, which is really an element of the Gasco's narrative. Slavery was not the true cause of war. It was really the Northern politician who did not respect Southern liberties. So Confederate soldiers fought heroically, but their defeat was unavoidable. And then there was a second part of the movie is about the Reconstruction Era and about the fact that enfranchised Black people, a serious threat to the political order. And it's, you know, there is a depiction of a Black man that is super racist and hateful. They are very aggressive, etc., etc. And so the Ku Klux, so you can see the picture, you know, with the picture with an actor with a black face here. And so the Ku Klux Klan is presented as a true restorer of a just social order. Okay, and then reconciliation took place for securing the supremacy of white men. And so here you have some excerpt that say the former enemies are united again, in common defense of the Aryan birthright. Okay. And this is a call for unity. Okay. So that's the movie. So what we do is that we correlate the screening of the movie at the county level, looking at a little bit more than 1,000 counties in the US between 1910 and 1920. And we correlate screening of the movie with changes in attitudes and behaviors. So this is a map of the counties in our sample before in 1914, so before the release of the movies, and in 1915, 1916, 1917. Okay, so we can trace the diffusion across the US territory of this movie and look at how attitudes and behaviors reacted to that screening. So technically, we do a difference in difference analysis where we can compare counties that were treated with the movie, that screens the movie, to counties that are in the control group and that were not treated, that did not screen the movie. And so we trace those counties before they are the screening of the movie, and then the treated group is treated, screens the movie, and then we compare the change in that. So it's really like a treatment control approach, you know. And so let me skip how we deal with causation here. Technically we do an instrumental, we follow an instrumental variable approach. The main challenge here to our empirical studies, if you want to interpret the effect in a causal way, you want to filter out the fact that, like in the Rwanda genocide paper, it could be that you have some counties, for example, in the Deep South, that were at first place racist and were in high demand of the movie, right? That's why they screen it. But at first place, they were racist and against the North already, okay? And so that's a demand effect. And so you want to filter out this demand effect. And in order to do that, you have to take into account supply side constraint and the fact that you had constraints such as some counties did or did not screen the movie independently of the willingness of the local population to watch the movie. Okay. So we use an instrumental variable approach. So what are the so all in all, we have 1,000 counties and in our sample, and a little bit less than 500, half of them did screen the movie over the 1915-1920 period. So the outcome variables we look at are first, we look at opinions toward reconciliation in local newspapers. So you have to think of this period just before the golden age of radio. There was no radio at that time. And so the main source of information for people were, and source of discussions, social media at that time, were local newspapers. So we use the newspaper.com online archive, where we can retrieve more than 25 million of pages, more than 3,000 newspapers, and conducted a systematic text analysis on this sample of counties. So we use a bag of words approach. So let me go fast on that, sorry for the sake of time. But basically, for each county in each month, we can build a measure of opinions toward reconciliation by counting, by comparing the numbers of the frequency of keywords that relate to patriotic rhetoric to the frequency of keywords that relate to divisive rhetoric. Okay. And what you observe is this thing. So before the screening at month 0 of the movie, if you compare a treated and a control county, there was no difference in rhetoric. But after the screening of the movie, you see a clear increase in pro-reconciliation rhetoric in the counties that screen the movie. Okay, yeah, 2 minutes. Another outcome variable we look at is, so this is the first outcome variable is about opinions and rhetorics in local newspapers. The second outcome variable we look at is a behavioral variable and relates to patriotism. And so we measure patriotism by looking at the number of voluntary enlistment in the US Navy at the county level. And here again, before screening, you observe no difference, no systematic difference between treated and untreated countries. But in those countries, after the screening of the movie, you observe an increase in voluntary enlistment in the US Navy in countries that treat the movie, that screen the movie. So you can also look at another dimension, which is about cultural convergence. You know, building a common identity is a very important component of nation building and reconciliation. And so what we look at is the tendency, what are the first names observed in census data for newborn babies in the North and in the South. And so we look at whether parents from the North, after being exposed to the movie, tend to give more South-sounding names to their first to their babies. Okay, and that's the reverse in the South. And we do observe that in the data. Okay, after screening the movie, people tend to give to give names that sound like more that belong to the culture of the former enemy. And then we look at discrimination of African Americans. So we build two measures of discrimination. One is a measure of discrimination on the housing market, labor market, and another is a measure of salience of white supremacy in local newspapers. Just to give you a sense of how we measure segregation, discrimination on the labor market, here we retrieve ads where it's mentioned white only in the ad. We want a maid white only. Okay, we want to rent this apartment to white only. And so those excerpts, those articles actually are, we report them because they are extracted from newspapers that are located in former Union states, okay, free states. Okay, so it means that you start to observe after the screening of the movie, even in the North, more discriminatory ads. Okay, I should stop, but I must really mention that because this is well known and it's important. We also know from, historians know that, and it has been quantitatively documented by Desmond Hong very recently. He has shown that also the screening of the birth of a nation massively contributed to increased lynching, to restore Ku Klux Klan, and he also showed that even in the early 2000s, there is a long-run persistence. In the early 2000s US, you observe more violence in counties that screened the movie at that time. Okay, so basically we come up with a set of evidence that the movie triggered reconciliation and at the same time increased racial hatred and discrimination against Afro-Americans. And so we conduct a mediation analysis where we can show that actually 1/2 of the total effect of the movie on reconciliation was mediated by the increase in discrimination. Okay, so it's really a logic of common enemy that is at work in this context. Okay, it's by segregating more that you can also foster more reconciliation. And so this paper, and I conclude, asks the question of, it questions the ability to genuinely reconcile a country when you do it by discriminating more one minority. Okay, but it's quite clear from this analysis that actually the lost cause narrative contributed to decrease the North-South cleavage and increase the white-black cleavage in the US. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
I'm going to take a few minutes from the minutes outside just to get a few questions together. Can we have like a couple of questions for Mathias, and then we can get Mathias to answer, and I'll check online. So if people do have questions, they want to. Those. One question, sir?
Thanks for the presentation. So I was wondering, after especially having heard about the first study, it seems to me, I think my impression is that these narratives seem quite sticky in that they persist for so long, and we can see how like the stickiness of these sort of practices sort of like they cause outcomes later in the future. And I was wondering if there have been any studies that show like how this can be disrupted, like does it take, what kind of exogenous or what kind of shocks or what sort of like methods are there that can sort of break this cycle and sort of like make these practices less sticky, or maybe sort of unravel them so that they don't create these problems in the future, and we don't create these outcomes in the future.
That's should I also know? Or? I take a couple of that. Yeah.
Other questions on the floor? Chucking one from the two from the chat, and you've got 3 questions to think about. So one from the chat is from Anna Jones saying, do you have any thoughts on the English Civil War, where there was a fracturing on beliefs rather than on ethnic rights? And then the second part of that is, how should we think about reconciliation after Brexit? There. I'm going to leave you with those 2 questions to answer.
I will focus on the first one. Look, yeah, no, well, the Brexit scene is difficult. I already made an achievement, which is having a statement by Napoleon Bonaparte in Oxford. So I think that was a bit provocative. Now talking about the Brexit and reconciliation. Yeah. No, more seriously, as for the first question, I think that's a fascinating question. I'm not aware. So there is a recent interest in economics for narratives and how narratives really can affect economic outcomes and behaviors in a meaningful way. But it's all about the naivety of economists who, for a long time, tend to presume that it was all about economic incentives, and so narratives are so shallow that they are meaningless. I'm quite sure that I would not be surprised, let's say, that whether in social psychology people have looked at how you can, whether first narratives are sticky, and if they are, how you can change them. What kind of intervention you can use to change their content and their substance. My presumption is that, I think I hope I was clear during the presentation, is that if you look at those 2 big categories of reasons underlying conflicts, it seems to me that there is one category, that pertains to socio-economic structure, to the institution quality, to natural resources. Those factors are really slow moving and sticky, as you would say. Whereas in my naive perception, seen from economics, I would expect beliefs and representation to be easier to change. But I must say that if you look at what happened over the past 5 years, this presumption, is a bit at odds with the fact. If you think of what we observed during the pandemic, it was impossible, to change the representation of some part of the population about the role of vaccines, about the origins of the pandemic, etc. And in particular, so part of the problem is that people tend to self-select the informational sources they are exposed to, right? So that's the story about echo chambers and those things. So it's also an aspect that I think I wanted to talk about. I have talked about during the presentation, is that when it turns to exposure to informational sources, demand side strength forces play a major role. People self-select into those sources. And so I think not only, so in economics, there is a surge of interest for those questions, how you can deal with fake news, how you can confront people to facts, etc., etc. But I think that's really not only in economics. I think maybe also in other social sciences. I think there is a rise of interest for those questions, in particular following the Trump presidency and what we observed during the pandemic. So, yeah, so fascinating question. I have no clear answer. So then there was another, not the Brexit one, but the second.
About the English Civil War, because maybe to be fair, that's maybe unfair to ask you because it's we haven't got the birth on the same way. Yeah. So maybe that is result of speculation. Let's have one last question, and then we'll
yeah. Thank you very much. No, this is really fascinating, especially looking at different parts of the world where you have competing narratives, such as in the Middle East, where you might have different groups trying to fight with different perception of what is right and how to lead society. In terms of looking at areas like that as like case studies, not specifically, in the past, how have competing narratives played out, and has imposed narratives by the state? So in this situation of the birth of the nation, it was imposed by the state, Woodrow Wilson endorsed it, but have a bottom part of the society with a different narrative. Does this have effect on the kind of the nation building from that?
Yeah, it's all a good question. Huh? What comes to my mind is what happened after the war in France. You know, many a coup d'éclat by de Gaulle. You know, an achievement by de Gaulle was to impose to the French society the narratives that first, not only to the French society, but also to part of the Allies, that the French won the war, were part of the, you know, contributed to the victory. But more, even a bigger achievement was that to impose a narrative to the French that actually the French, during the war, were all resistance. And it took 30 years. It's only in the early 70s that historians started to question the fact that no, French people were not resistant during the war. You know, some of them were, many of them were nothing, just trying to survive, and a non-marginal minority was collaborating with Nazi Germany. And so this is, and that's where, wow, I'm referring to de Gaulle and Bonaparte in the same lecture. You know, it's a bit of a caricature and a cliche. But you see, it's part of the political talent of de Gaulle to manage to impose this narrative after, in spite of having many competing narratives, you know, just after the war, about the role of the communist resistance, for example. Communist resistance played, like in Italy, you know, a major role in French resistance. But they were completely obliterated by de Gaulle in 44 and 45. You know, so that's an example where actually there were competitions between different narratives in 40, just after the war in France, and de Gaulle managed to impose his view. Not forever, but at least for 2 decades.
Let me stop here. We could keep on talking for a long time. So just before we thank you last time, I just want to say one thing in terms of the reason why Mathias is such a fantastic kickoff starter, first Centenary Professor, is because it really highlights to me the way that economics can be used in different contexts. And to think about economics as addressing kind of first world problems, first order societal problems. And I think that what you've shown us today is exactly an example of that, of how this is a kind of key issue, and we can use economics, use politics together to think about this in a better way. So thank you very much, Mathias. Thank you.
Thanks.